Have you all ever explored balance indicators at a sort of win rate and ban rate? I mean, there's lots of ways you can determine balance. It really just depends on like how you want to determine balance as a balanced team. You could do things like pick rate. You could do things like feel. Like you could survey players and ask them like who feels good, who feels bad, right? You could do things like experienced win rate. The idea that it's not actually a character's win rate that matters, it's a character's win rate when you've played 300 games on them that matters. And balance all the characters to have, you know, the appropriate win rate after 300 games. Like there's a lot of different ways you can potentially balance based on certain data metrics. My personal take on data-based balancing is, I would say data is very important for information, but it gets dangerous when it becomes something like an end-all be-all, because a lot of like values for the game aren't necessarily captured by data. So here's an example, and this example is nebulous. There isn't a right answer. I think a number of you will hear it and you might come to different conclusions, but it's worth thinking about, right? Okay, let's say there's a character, and that character is overpowered statistically. They win a lot of games, but they A, do not feel overpowered, meaning the people who play them don't think they're strong, and B, do not feel overpowered or frustrating to play against. The people who play against them don't think they're strong either. Let's start with that. What do you do? Again, statistically they win all their games, but almost no one in the game believes them to be strong. What do you do? On one hand, you could tell players, yo, character's OP, look at this data, right? And players would probably respond to that with, what are you talking about? But the game likely is more objectively balanced. You could also go the flip side, and you could be like, hey, we're gonna buff this character because y'all think it's weak. And by doing that, you've maybe made players who think it's strong, but that might come at the cost of the game being less objectively balanced. That could be bad. That could be potentially bad. Let's add a data point to it. Imagine this character. So again, the character is very powerful statistically speaking, but no one thinks it's powerful. Let's add another thing. When you survey players, they say that that character is the most fun to play against. Okay? So you have a character who is statistically powerful, no one thinks it's powerful, and players love playing against it. They absolutely love playing against it. They're like, this character is so fun to play against. Should you buff it? Should you nerf it? Again, on one hand, sorry, we need a reason or numbers. Okay, 53% win rate. If you need numbers, 53% win rate. The reason I'm not using numbers though, is I'm trying to like create an illustration of like, there's a difference between perception and balance for any number you give, right? Like if I give you a statistic that says this character is strong, it could be win rate, it could be ban rate, it could be experienced win rate, it could be pick rate. There's a lot of statistics that could potentially point towards a character being strong, right? And so the reason I'm being abstract about it is I'm like kind of like just trying to give you a thought exercise, right? It's like the thought exercise is you have a character that is statistically powerful. People don't think it's powerful. And then again, we've added this third thing, which is players like playing against it. Do you buff it? Like that's the question. Or potentially, do you nerf it? If you nerf it, statistically, the game is more balanced. The game is more objectively balanced. If you buff it, the game potentially would become more fun and enjoyable because people like playing against it. And so if you buff it, it'll probably be in more games, right? Or maybe you don't touch it at all because maybe the reason it's so fun to play against at its current tuning is that it doesn't feel all that powerful for people. And maybe people, when it actually does feel powerful, people like have less fun against it. That would be an example, though, if you buffed it, that would be an example of a strategy called picking, I would call picking winners. It's kind of an idea that, like, as a designer, one of your options when balancing a game is you could potentially choose what is powerful in your game based on what you believe would be the best game experience for your players. That could be good, but it could come at the cost of objective game balance. It could come at the cost of quite literally making your game unbalanced. Let's talk about this with a game system, okay? So imagine you have an item, okay? And this item, you know, will make the game better. I don't know. I know a lot of you want like a more concrete example. So imagine it was a tank meta and you have an item that kills tanks. And so you're fairly certain that it would make the game better if this item was buffed. Or alternately, it's like you have an assassin meta and you have an item that protects people from assassins. And you're fairly certain that if you buff the anti-assassin item, the game gets better in an assassin meta, right? Okay, we'll start with that. So you have an item, and you believe that by buffing that item, the game will get better. But again, we have a problem. The problem is, statistically speaking, that item is already powerful. Statistically speaking, when people buy that item, it's very powerful. Your players tell you it's powerful. They're like, this is a great item. It does what I want. It's really good. It's super useful, right? And so it's already powerful, right? So statistically speaking, it's powerful, but you believe that if you were to buff that item, the game would get better for whatever reason. Do you buff it? On one hand, by buffing it, you're probably making it deliberately overpowered. On the other hand, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that item being a very powerful thing in the game and in the meta ends up being good for the outcomes you're looking for in the game. If you wanted to, you know, make assassins worse if it was anti-assassin, or make tanks worse if it was anti-tank, or make AD carries worse if it was anti-AD carry, right? Those are things to think about. Here's another one. We'll put one more in this like thought experiment. You have an item that no one thinks is powerful and no one buys. But you know that if you buffed it to be completely broken, people would start buying it. And again, you legitimately think the game will be better if people bought it. But to get people to buy it, you have to make it completely broken. And then, you know, people will buy it, they'll catch on, and then, you know, you could probably tune it down after that, right? What do? Is that a good change? Is that a good change to get people to buy this item? And by making it completely broken. I did this, by the way. I did this with... Here, I'll show you. Where is it? A long time ago, before the current rune system, we had something called Keystone Masteries. Keystone Masteries were, you know, kind of the start of what eventually were Keystones, the Keystone runes, things like that. When Keystone Masteries came out, this tree here was called the Cunning Tree. And the important thing to know for all of you about the Cunning Tree is people were primed from the runes and masteries before this system to go the offense tree if you wanted to be damaging. So everybody who wanted to deal damage, including assassins, this is an important note, would go offense. And then this system came out, and the Cunning Tree, we intended the Cunning Tree to be for assassins. We had things like Thunderlord's Decree, which is modern Electrocute. Thunderlord's Decree said if you hit someone 3 times, it lightning bolts them, and it does bonus damage. And we also had Storm Raider Surge. And it's like, this tree was intended to be the assassin tree. But because when this came out, everybody who played the game previously assumed that offense equaled damage, everybody was going the damage tree over here. So we had Thunderlord's Decree. It was a viable rune, but no one was taking it. And so what I did is I buffed Thunderlord's Decree. And I buffed it too much. I did not only make it viable, I made it overpowered. And what ended up happening is people then swapped to Thunderlord's Decree because it was OP, and suddenly we had a 10 Thunderlord's Decree meta. There was 10 Thunderlord's Decrees in every single game. Obviously that was bad. But then we nerfed it. And then people took Thunderlord's Decree. And so the thing I'm mentioning here is we went from very few people take the thing, buff the thing, for a patch you have Thunderlord's Decree meta. It was actually overpowered. Then you nerf it. And then at the end of that whole cycle, after those 2 weeks, you have a more diverse rune meta where people are taking Thunderlord's Decree because they finally know how good it is and they realize that it's good. But the cost there is you had 2 weeks of 10 Thunderlords, which, you know, maybe wasn't great. And like, again, I'm just like mentioning things where it's like, hey, what do you do when you have a champion or a rune or a system that you think people should be taking, but they don't take it for whatever reason, but you think the game might be better if they did? There's a lot of like things you could think about when talking about buffing or nerfing something like that.